Settle in, folks. It's time to wander into a chapter of the past you might not have heard before. You can almost hear the low creak of the wooden yoke across your shoulders, the slosh of water threatening to spill from the heavy clay buckets. Your bare feet press into damp earth, and behind you, a cottage smokes softly, like it's sighing into the cold morning. Welcome to a woman's life in the medieval countryside. Not a noble woman, not a nun, not a queen. Just you. And your day has barely begun. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fire must be rekindled before the sun fully rises. You shuffle into the hearthroom with your skirt still damp from the dew, and you feed the embers from last night with careful hands. If it dies out, you'll have to beg a coal from a neighbor or, heaven forbid, resort to firestones and hope you're luckier than yesterday. And while the fire hisses to life, so does the house. The children stir on their straw beds, the dog stretches like he too has work to do, and your husband's cough echoes from the loft. There is no moment of pause, no warm tea waiting for you, no quiet time. The quiet itself is filled with the sound of survival. You, like most women of your station, are the unseen architecture of this world. You carry water for everyone, cook with smoke in your eyes, and mend clothing with fingers so calloused they might as well be leather gloves. And yet nobody writes your name down. Not in parish records, not in ballads, not even in family memory half the time. Here's your historical fact. For the night, the average medieval woman walked several miles each day just for basic survival. Water, firewood, food. You moved like a human supply chain. Some scholars have tried to calculate the caloric output of a medieval peasant woman. Let's just say, if this were a modern gym class, you'd have outpaced the instructor before breakfast. Now let's chew on something delightfully absurd. Did you know that there were actual water-carrying competitions in some villages? As if the sheer exhaustion of daily life wasn't enough, they turned it into entertainment. Sometimes girls would race to bring water back from the well in exchange for small favors, bits of cloth, or even just a moment of public attention. It was all in jest, of course, but always reminded everyone just how fast and strong these dainty women could be. But here's the question. Historians still debate, was this invisible labor respected or merely expected? We romanticize it now. The pastoral woman cheeks, flushed from exertion, sleeves rolled up a soft breeze, catching the edges of her linen cap. But the truth is, you weren't admired. You were essential, yes, but in the same way, a well-functioning oven is essential, and just as replaceable. You lift, you carry, you knead dough, while singing a tune passed down from a grandmother whose name you never knew. You hush a fussy child with the rhythm of your rocking, even as your back throbs, and your dinner threatens to boil over. All this with no break, no applause, no recognition, and yet somehow you make room for beauty. You smooth your apron before visitors arrive. You braid your daughter's hair, even if yours is tangled. You hum a lullaby as you churn butter, knowing that the rhythm helps both the butter and the baby calm. There is something ancient and sacred in your pace. You don't hurry exactly because there's no such thing as finished. When you draw water from the well, you also draw from a lineage of women who did exactly the same in silence and snow. in sun, again and again. Their backs were bent. Yours might be too, in time. But you do it because you must, and maybe because you want something to survive, something to keep burning, even if it's just the hearth fire. And here's a curious little twist. In some regions, women believed the way you carried water could shape your children's future. Sloshing too much meant bad luck. Spilling was frowned upon no worse, it was an omen. A careless woman raised careless children. So even the tilt of your shoulder was scrutinized. No pressure. Still, you carry on. You carry the weight of generations and breakfast and fatigue and hope, all without fanfare. No trumpets, no stained glass windows telling your story. Just this moment, your hands red from scrubbing your breath, fogging the cold air, your mind already planning lunch. This is the beginning of your tale. Not because it is grand, but because it is real. It is what kept villages alive, what kept fields sown and babies growing. Without you, this entire little corner of the world would unravel. So tonight, while you lie in your imagined medieval bed, scratchy blanket draft from the thatch above, maybe a warm dog by your feet, know this. You are the spine of history, and no matter how little they wrote about you, you carried it all anyway. The cold rush of dawn air hasn't yet left your bones when another call comes low, urgent, full of meaning. A neighbor's daughter has gone into labor. The child is early, they say, or late, depending on which moon you were counting. And just like that, you are no longer simply a woman fetching water or baking bread. You are the one who knows. You wrap your shawl tight and head across the village. The streets are hushed, dirt, rutted with the tracks of ox carts, but quiet now, as if the earth itself holds its breath. Behind one crooked door, a young woman cries out, and you're welcomed not with fanfare, but with a nod of grim relief. The midwife is here. Here's your historical truth. Midwifery wasn't a fringe skill in medieval Europe. It was an institution of its own. Women trained, other women passed secrets down like recipes and wielded a kind of practical power that made some men very, very nervous. Now, for the quirk in parts of France, midwives were once required to swear oaths that they would not bewitch the child or mother or use spells when cutting the umbilical cord. Because, of course, bringing new life into the world couldn't possibly happen without suspicion of sorcery. Academic minds still argue about this. Were midwives feared because they were powerful, or were they powerful because they were feared? In this moment, though, you're not pondering philosophy. You're kneeling beside a girl, barely old enough to understand what's happening. She clutches her belly, sweat slicking her brow. Her mother hovers nearby, mumbling prayers and occasionally biting her own knuckles. You whisper soothing nonsense. You press a warm cloth to the girl's back. You monitor the contractions by instinct, by the shift in her breathing, by the way her fingernails dig into the straw mattress. You've done this before many times, and each time is both ordinary and terrifying. She asks you if she'll die. You say no, because what else can you say? But you think of all the others who bled too long, whose babies came breech, whose luck ran out. And you keep working. This labor takes hours. Time loses its shape. The fire burns low, then high again. The wind moans through the thatch above. Outside, the village carries on. Children chase chickens. Men argue over livestock. The baker burns another crust. But inside this room, the world is reduced to blood and breath and bone. Finally, the child arrives. Red and wet and furious, she announces herself with a wail that feels like a victory and a warning all at once. You clean her gently, check her tiny limbs, wrap her tight. The mother sobs not from joy or grief, but exhaustion so profound it nearly undoes her. You hand the baby over and begin to clean up the rest, the mess, the linens, the blood. You do it quietly, your own hands shaking just a little. And for this, you may one day be questioned. Because who is this woman who can bring forth life, who knows herbs to slow bleeding and teas to ease pain, who whispers prayers that aren't Latin, who hums a tune from her mother's mother's mother and burns dried herbs no priest has blessed? You are a vessel of knowledge in a world that distrusts knowing, and especially distrusts you for having it. Even today, historians puzzle over the dual role of midwives in the medieval world. Revered one day, reviled the next. In some towns, you are paid in eggs and cloth, treated like a minor miracle. In others, you are brought before a bishop and asked to explain why your hands do what the church cannot. But back in this room, the baby's quiet now. The girl sleeps pale and trembling, but alive. And you, your work done, slip back into the morning mist unnoticed. The fire's warm back at your cottage. Your own children wait. Another day begins. And here's another strange detail to tuck into your mind. In some medieval manuals, midwives were advised to tie red threads around their fingers or the mother's ankles to protect against spirits. Superstition, braided with science always, as if tying string could keep the line between life and death from snapping. You know better. You always have. As you walk home, a neighbor nods. Another offers you a crust of bread and a wink. They know what you do. They just don't always know what to make of it. And that's fine. You didn't choose this path to be thanked. You chose it because you could not look away when someone was in pain. Because your mother showed you how. Because someone has to do it. By the time the sun clears the roof lines, you've returned to your own hearth. You wash your hands in silence. You tuck away the herbs used already drying more. You hum again, low and steady. The house picks up its rhythm. The world keeps spinning. And no one, not even you, quite knows how many lives you've saved. But tonight, as you lie down and let the weariness settle in your bones, remember this. You are not merely a helper. You are history's quiet architect. And through every whispered breath of birth, you carry forward the miracle of continuation. Bread and bruises. Feeding a family on less than nothing. The morning comes too soon. Again. You rise before the sun, your body still aching from yesterday's work. But the bread won't knead itself, and mouths will be waiting soon, small and wide-eyed, and utterly unforgiving if the crust isn't crisp and the center soft. There's a sack of barley, just barley, not wheat, because that's for people with coin, and a few handfuls of peas shriveled from storage. You grind them with rhythm, and resolve your hands moving in a pattern you could follow even in your sleep. Which, let's be honest, you basically are. Now here's the truth. Medieval peasant women were the backbone of the household economy. They didn't just cook. They planted, harvested, bartered, dried, salted, brewed, baked, and somehow managed not to collapse. And the odd detail, some women even chewed grain into a paste with their own teeth to start the fermentation process for beer or bread. That's right. Your mouth as a starter culture. Delicious. The debate, among scholars, of course, is whether this ceaseless domestic labor gave women quiet power or simply reinforced their invisibility. Did the kitchen become a kingdom or a cage? You don't have time to answer. The baby is crying. Again. And the eldest just knocked over the milk jug, chasing a chicken through the yard. You scold with the weariness of someone who's repeated the same phrase 1,000 times. Then you clean. Again. You scoop flour from a wooden box, mix it with lukewarm water and a pinch of salt, then start kneading. The dough is lumpy. It doesn't matter. It's bread. The firewood is damp. The smoke stings your eyes. The neighbors already have their fires going. One curses loud enough for you to hear another sings a tune her grandmother used to hum. You smile. It's not all bad. You remember when the Lord Steward came through last winter, counting chickens and measuring grain. He didn't speak to you, of course, just wrote numbers in his book, like you were part of the furniture. But he saw the rows of jars, the hung herbs, the salt pork curing by the fire. He knew. Women kept this whole rotten world spinning, and still no one writes your name down. But let's pause on that thought just for a moment, because it's worth saying, your work, every stirring, chopping, feeding, sweeping, is not just women's work. It's world-making, the very glue of survival. History is told through battles and kings, but without women like you, no one would have had the strength to swing a sword in the first place. Still no time for philosophy. The bread goes in the oven, a clay dome you built yourself, with hands that should have been broken years ago, but somehow keep moving. It smells good. It smells like not starving. You step outside to check the hens. 2 eggs. 1 cracked. 1 perfect. You take the perfect one inside like a prize and think fleetingly about how something so small can feel so miraculous. You start boiling the peas for dinner, knowing full well no one will thank you. But when they sit around the fire tonight, and the youngest dips crust into the thin broth and sighs like he's eating from a lord's table, you'll feel it. That tiny flicker of something close to peace. Sometimes you barter. One woman has cabbage, another has cheese. You trade bread for a cup of ale. Then someone whispers about the miller's wife, how her loaves are lighter. Is she mixing in flour, stolen from the manor's stockpile? Or maybe she's just lucky. Or maybe it's envy. You don't ask. You keep your eyes low and your dough soft. Because in this world, a good loaf can make a woman popular or suspicious. That's the tension, isn't it? Do too little and you're lazy. Do too much and you're unnatural. A woman who feeds too well must be cheating somehow. Or worse, witching her oven with charms. One widow down the lane was accused of just that last spring. Her bread rose too fast, too high, too beautifully. The village priest called it divine intervention, but the neighbors weren't convinced. She doesn't speak much anymore. So you keep your head down and your crusts humble. Let the flavor be quiet and the miracles go unmentioned. You gather nettles from the hedgerow, wrap them in cloth to boil down into something green and vaguely edible. Add a pinch of herbs. Stir with your whole body. Serve with a smile that says, "This is enough," even when it isn't. And here's your academic debate. For the night, was this daily ingenuity a form of resistance? Did these women find power in their anonymity, in their quiet competence, or did they disappear into it, smothered by obligation? Either way, the table is set. The children crowd around. The broth is warm. The bread is firm. Someone laughs. Someone spills. You barely taste the food, but your heart quiets. Later, you sit alone by the fire. You rub your back. Your hands smell of smoke and onion. You think about your mother's bread, your grandmother's soup. Generations stacked like bowls in a cupboard, each one slightly chipped, but still holding. And you wonder if one day, someone will remember this. Maybe not your name, but maybe the way your bread smelled, or the way your voice hummed when you stirred the pot. Maybe the miracle wasn't that you fed them at all, but that you did it every single day. And you still do. The first frost crept in overnight. It didn't knock. It didn't ask. It simply took up residence between your toes, and made itself quite at home in the corners of your poorly sealed cottage. You wake to the taste of cold air on your tongue, and the feeling that your bones are being slowly replaced with ice. The fire died sometime during the night, and though the baby clings to your side like a living coal, you know it's time to rise. Again, let's be clear. Winter in the medieval countryside wasn't charming. It wasn't all snowflakes and mulled wine. It was endless, harsh, gray. And for women like you, it was a test of quiet genius, how to stretch a dwindling store of grain, how to keep damp wool from turning to rot, how to make life bearable when the sky seemed to have forgotten the color blue. Now, the historical fact. In medieval Europe, winters were often so severe that famine regularly followed a bad harvest. And while men complained loudly, women endured quietly, their labor tripling while sunlight halved. The odd detail, some women wore woolen undergarments soaked in lard to stay warm. Yes, lard, bacon grease. Because when you don't have insulation, you improvise with breakfast. The question for the scholars tonight, does survival through such constant adaptation count as resistance? Or is it just suffering cleverly managed? You pull on your woolen shift, scratchy and stiff from yesterday's wear. No time to wash it. Washing uses soap, and soap requires lye, and lye burns. If it gets in your eyes, ask the miller's daughter. She blinked for 2 days straight. You move toward the hearth, brushing frost from the edge of the stool. You gather the smallest bits of dry kindling, blow gently, and coax the flame like a friend who's mad at you, but still shows up. The fire coughs, sputters, then begins to breathe. It's not much, but it's something. You check the pantry. There's a turnip with a suspicious spot, a handful of dried beans, half a wheel of cheese that smells increasingly philosophical. You scrape off the soft parts and make a stew that pretends to be more than it is. And then you start the stitching. Winter is mending seasoned tunics, torn by bramble socks, unraveling hems, coming loose from too much kneeling. The needle dances. Your hands follow. You use whatever thread you can find, wool, linen, even horsehair, if necessary. You remember your neighbor's tale of a woman who stitched her husband's burial shroud from leftover curtain scraps. It was striped. The priest said nothing. Someone knocks at the door. It's Agneta, face red from wind, nose running arms full of damp laundry. The stream's frozen, she grunts. Want to boil together? You nod. Boiling clothes together saves firewood. Also gossip. Together, the two of you sit beside the bubbling pot. You whisper over the steam, your voices threading in and out like steam through a cracked window. She's pregnant again. No. Yes. And her eldest isn't even 4? A shared sigh. A pause. You think they'll make it through winter? I think she'll carry them, like always. And isn't that the story? Women carrying more than they ever asked for. Not just children, and buckets, and bundles of sticks, but memories, burdens entire households, silent as frost, strong as stone. You carry the laundry back in with numb fingers, hang it by the fire, and try not to think about what happens if it doesn't dry in time. Wet clothes mean illness. Illness means no work. No work means no food. Later the baby coughs. Not much. Just enough to make your heart clench. You feel his forehead. Warm. Too warm. You grind dried elderberry and thyme into a poultice and whisper something that feels like both science and prayer. The baby settles. You rock him and hum. Outside the snow starts. Inside the silence grows. And as the wind howls against the cracks in the shutters, you wrap yourself in 2 layers of patched wool and ask no one in particular, is this strength or simply surrender? You don't know. But you wake again the next day and the next. And that for now is answer enough. By now, your fingers know the dough better than you know your own reflection. Because really, how often do you get to see yourself? There are no mirrors in your cottage, only polished pots and puddles. You wake with flour still tucked under your nails, the memory of yeast in your nose, and the weight of morning already sitting behind your eyes. It's baking day. Again. Because bread is not a luxury, it's life. And women like you are the quiet architects of that life, each loaf a small act of rebellion against starvation. Here's the historical fact to chew on with your crust. In many medieval villages, women were responsible for baking, not just for their households, but often for entire communities, sometimes under the supervision of manorial lords, sometimes in communal ovens. And woe to the woman who overstepped the weight or portion prescribed. Now, a delightfully strange detail in some regions, bread was so heavily taxed and regulated that women secretly added mashed beans, acorns, or even ground-up fern roots to stretch the flour. Yes, fern. Technically edible. Barely digestible. Entirely desperate. The academic question rising like sourdough, is this if every loaf was a negotiation between hunger obedience and invention, was medieval, baking an early form of protest. You light the fire first. The hearth groans. Smoke twitches up the chimney. You measure with your palm, because measuring cups don't exist here, and even if they did, they'd probably belong to the Reeves' wife. The flour is gritty. The water is cold. The yeast is stubborn. But your hands are steady. Kneading is therapy you don't have a name for yet. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. With each rhythm, you drive out the ghosts in your chest. With each breath, you summon one more reason to keep going. Your daughter watches you from the corner. Her dress is patched at the knees. Her fingers are tucked beneath her chin. She is learning, even when she says nothing. You smile at her. She sticks out her tongue. Outside, the church bells ring the hour. Not that you need them. You've been tracking time by the rise and fall of dough since your first moon bleed. Once the bread is shaped, you carry the tray carefully to the communal oven. It's your turn today. The blackened stone gapes open like a beast. You slide the loaves in and say a quiet word, not a prayer exactly, but something old and female that sounds like "don't burn this time." Magret is there already. She's got 6 loaves and 1 bad attitude. They say the new miller is cheating the weights. She whispers, teeth clenched. You nod. Of course he is. They always are. It's part of the ritual grain in lies out. Back home, the wait begins. You churn butter while the bread bakes. You milk the goat. You hush the baby. You answer your husband's grunt with a nod. All while thinking about how to fix the seam in the roof before it rains again. When you return, the air near the oven smells like something between heaven and desperation. The crust has blistered beautifully. Your loaves sing tiny cracks as they cool. But then, of course, a man in a faded tabard stops you. He eyes your bread, weighs it, pokes it. This one's too light, he mutters. You say nothing. He confiscates it. That's one less dinner. One more empty plate. You walk away, jaw tight, eyes dry. You are not allowed to shout. So you squeeze the warm loaf in your hand a little harder. At home, the family eats in silence. Bread dipped in broth. Bread crumbled into the baby's mouth. Bread tucked into cloth for the next day's labor. You chew slowly. Your mind is already in tomorrow. Later, as the house dims and the fire sleeps, your daughter crawls into your lap and asks, "Do you think bread can listen?" You blink. Because if it can, she says yours always listens. You brush flour from her forehead, pull the blanket higher, and wonder just briefly if perhaps in all this kneading you've passed something else into the dough memory maybe. Or resilience. Or the taste of a woman who will not be crushed no matter how many times the world tries to press her flat. And with that thought, you sleep with the scent of baked hope still clinging to your hair. You're up before the rooster this time. There's no mistaking the sound, a rhythmic knock at your door that doesn't belong to a merchant or a neighbor begging for flour. No, this is the knock of urgency, of breathless fear, of someone about to bring life or lose it. You wrap your shawl, grab your satchel, and step out into a fog that tastes like wet wool and secrets. The birth is already underway. It always is by the time they send for you. They wait until the very last minute, as if admitting they need a woman who knows more than they do is some sort of sin. Let's start with the truth. In medieval Europe, midwives were indispensable and ubiquitous. Nearly every village had one. Sometimes trained by older women, sometimes simply thrown into it by necessity. They held in their hands the fragile line between life and death. Here's the strange detail that catches your breath. A number of midwives were also the neighborhood herbalists, keepers of bone pins, salves, and charms. One midwife, in 13th century records, was known to tuck iron scissors beneath the birthing bed to ward off spirits. Another swore by whispering prayers into a boiled egg. And the debate still lingers. Like smoke, were these women seen as guardians of sacred knowledge, or as dangerous wielders of too much unseen power? You arrive at the hut just as the first scream splits the air. Inside, a young girl is doubled over on a mat of straw. Her mother weeps softly into her apron. The room is thick with the smell of wood ash sweat and lavender rubbed into the walls for strength. You do not waste time. Boil the water, knot the cord, rub the hips, whisper something that sounds like confidence. They need your certainty more than anything. Her labor is long. You hum. You wait. You touch her hand, her shoulder, her brow. At one point, you hand her a bundle of nettle to squeeze not for magic, but for distraction. Pain needs a shape to hold on to. And when the baby finally slips out slippery and wailing, the mother gasps, and her own cry is louder than the child's. You know what comes next. You weigh the baby in your hands like a loaf of bread. Perfect, tiny, hungry, a girl. You wrap her and pass her to her mother, who barely has strength to reach out. Then you turn to the rest, the afterbirth, the blood, the slow inching back of life into a body that nearly gave up. It's not until the fire dims that you let yourself sit. There is no pay, of course, or sometimes a chicken, a pinch of salt, a promise of favor when winter comes. And yet, you carry on, because no one else will. You know every remedy for a torn womb, every chant whispered against a breach, every herb that might stop the bleeding, and which ones the priest says you're not allowed to touch. They fear you, respect you, whisper about you when you pass. You've been called a saint. You've been called a witch, sometimes both in the same week. One time, the Lord's wife miscarried, and you were summoned in secret. You stitched her back together while the chapel bells rang, as if to erase your presence. Another time, a stillbirth. You held the mother as she howled, then buried the child with your own hands behind the cottage where the soil was softest. That night, someone left thorns in your doorway, just in case you had brought it on with your knowing. Even now, as you walk home in the thin blue light of morning, your fingers ache not from work, but from the pressure of holding back everything you can't say out loud. Because your knowledge isn't written down. It's not cataloged or sanctioned. It lives in your hands, your tongue, your bones. And that makes it dangerous. Still, as you arrive back at your own hearth and reheat the stale broth from last night, you remember the girl's eyes, wide stunned, relieved, as you handed her that slippery miracle. She will remember you. Maybe she'll become you. Maybe not. But you've left your knowledge behind, folded into her life like yeast in dough. And that is how women survive. Not with loud declarations or titles, but through each other. Through moments like these, quietly changing the course of everything. Your drying time over the hearth again. Not for seasoning stew, though heaven knows the soup could use it, but for healing. The kind that soaks into skin and quiets a fever before it climbs too high. A neighbor asked you quietly this morning near the well if you had anything for her husband's cough. You nodded and whispered something about sage boiled in ale, but you saw her eyes flicker. She knows, and she worries. Everyone worries when a woman knows too much. Here's the fact, crisp and uncomfortable by the 15th century. Across much of Europe, knowledge of plants, especially in women's hands, was becoming suspicious. Not just quaint or useful. Not even heretical, not yet. Just uneasy. And here's the oddity. Some towns made lists. Actual lists of plants that honest women should never grow. Mandrake, of course. Belladonna, naturally. Even mugwort, for heaven's sake, a plant so humble it grows beside ditches. Why? Because they were linked to midwives to healing outside the church, to women who didn't ask for permission to know what they knew. So tell me what's more dangerous, the knowledge or the woman who dares to remember it? You cradle a bundle of dried yarrow, now tying the stems with thread spun from flax you grew yourself. It smells like dust and rain. You learned this from your grandmother, who learned it from hers. No books, no parchment, just breath to breath, word to word. The irony, of course, is that monks wrote down these recipes too, in beautiful Latin, in ink made from oak gall and vinegar. But when a woman mixes the same tincture at her table, suddenly it's suspect. Tonight, A girl from the miller's family is coming with her mother. The girl's monthly bleeding hasn't come in 3 turns of the moon, and she's pale with worry. You know what they want, and you know what they'll never ask out loud. You heat the kettle slowly. Too fast, and the infusion turns bitter. You choose wild parsley pennyroyal and a pinch of rue. Just enough to stir the blood, as they say. Not too much. Never too much. When they arrive, you serve the tea in a chipped cup with a ribbon of blue glaze. You don't say anything. They don't either. The girl drinks, makes a face, then sits quietly while the mother slips a coin into your apron pocket. This isn't just medicine. It's trust. It's risk. And you both know it. Outside, wind stirs the thatch. A dog barks. Somewhere far off, the bell of the parish chapel tolls vespers. You do not pray aloud. But your hands move like a liturgy as you wipe down your table, rinse the cup, hang the herbs to dry once more. There are stories whispered in town squares and over ale at inns of women burned or drowned for this, for knowing too much, for healing too quietly, for offending God by not relying solely on prayer. But you don't feel wicked. You feel tired. And there's the scholarly debate that flickers behind every whispered accusation. Were these women feared because of what they did, or because of what they represented? Independence, experience, the audacity to trust their own minds and their own hands in a world that told them to ask permission. You have no interest in politics or power. You just want babies to survive, for bones to mend, for women not to die of simple things that have simple remedies. But that's the problem, isn't it? You make it look too simple, too natural, too female. You crouch by the hearth tonight, turning a parchment scrap over in your fingers like it might sing. The ink is brown, the letters angular, half faded. You can't read all of it, not yet, but you're trying. Slowly, secretly. Because let's face it, in your world, a woman who reads might as well be carrying fire. Here's the truth. They don't print in sermons by the late Middle Ages. Literacy among women was growing, especially among nuns, merchant wives, and yes, even some daughters of cobblers and weavers. But still, it wasn't always encouraged and rarely celebrated. After all, why should a woman read when her duties are spinning, kneading, and enduring? And yet, here you are, reading. The church says knowledge is sacred, but too much knowledge in your hands that smells suspicious, that looks like Eve again, plucking the wrong fruit from the wrong tree. And what about the curious detail that often gets glossed over in the dusty corners of chronicles? Women sometimes learn to read not from priests, but from each other. From literate widows, from midwives with prayer books, from bored noble daughters who slipped servants little bits of psalms. Imagine that rebellion in the form of phonics. Now, to be clear, you're not reading Ovid under candlelight while conjuring revolutions. You're puzzling out inventory records, recipes, herbal notes. But that's enough. Enough to notice patterns, spot mistakes, make choices. Enough to think. Tonight, your cousin's husband says over supper that reading makes women sad. He says he heard it from a friar. You smile politely and ladle more turnips into his bowl. Then you go to bed, and by lantern light trace a sentence from a discarded psalter tucked beneath your mattress. It's in Latin. You know just enough to guess. It might say something about grace, or rain, or the end of the world. That's the magic of it. Words holding multiple meanings, just like women do. Here's the scholarly debate that still lingers. Did medieval men fear literate women because they might spread dangerous ideas? Or was it the act itself, silent, contemplative sovereign, that felt like a threat? A woman reading doesn't need permission to think, and perhaps that above all unsettled the order of things. They tried to tether women's minds to embroidery hoops and baking stones. But language is sly. It slips between cracks. It lives on lips. It curls into lullabies and lingers in shared stories. So you start teaching your youngest sister letters, just the round ones for now. She giggles at the way O feels like a wheel and S like a serpent. You whisper their names like spells. She doesn't yet know this could be dangerous. You let her laugh. Because you remember that not so long ago, a woman in Rouen was condemned for copying texts without approval. Not heretical texts, mind you, just texts. The idea of her labor being unseen, unauthorized, was enough to make some men twitch. And there were other women, too. Scribes hidden behind initials, translators, whose names were erased in rebindings, authors mistaken for monks, because surely no woman could write like that. You wonder if someday someone will find your clumsy annotations and think them charming, or seditious, or both. By the way, in a strange twist of history, some of the earliest surviving English cookbooks were compiled by women. Recipes notes, margins full of corrections. Women weren't just keeping homes. They were curating knowledge with greasy fingers and ink-stained thumbs. Tonight, you practice writing your name. Just once. Carefully. Then you burn the scrap in the hearth. Not out of shame. Out of survival. Because even now, in the safety of your cottage, you feel the invisible weight of watching eyes. Not your neighbors. They're mostly too tired to care. It's the idea of eyes. The thought that someone somewhere might decide you've gone too far. But here's the quiet power. Once you learn to read the world, can't go back to being silent. You spot things. You notice shifts. You ask questions. And medieval women who asked too many questions were often called something else, heretics, disruptive, proud, maybe even witches. So you keep your books hidden and your knowledge closer. You teach in whispers. You read in slivers. You protect your spark because it's not just yours, it belongs to every daughter who comes after. You close your eyes and imagine a time when reading won't feel like trespassing. A time when a girl can scrawl her name without fear of flame. But for now, you memorize the psalm beneath your breath and tuck the parchment back under your straw mattress. It smells faintly of ink and wood smoke, and it is enough to carry you through the night. You slip out just before dawn, basket in hand, feet bare against the dew-soaked grass. The moon still lingers pale and curious as you duck beneath the hedgerow and make your way toward the stream. You're not gathering food. You're collecting secrets. In the folds of your apron lie sprigs of mugwort and feverfew, a pinch of valerian root, and something sharp-smelling you call church mint, though no priest has ever blessed it. You learn their names not from a book, but from the old midwife who lives past the mill, the one with a back like a question mark and eyes that see right through you. She doesn't speak much, but when she does, the earth listens. Here's the popular history lesson for tonight. Medieval medicine was a patchwork of charm, chance, and cautious guessing. Universities taught mostly men, but healing the gritty, bloody, real kind often fell to women. They were midwives, herbalists, caretakers. They stitched wounds, birthed babies, brewed tonics. They learned from mothers and from time, and they weren't always thanked for it. Because while people might call for you when fever strikes or labor stalls, they may also call you names when you heal too well. And that brings us to the strangeness of your situation. You can recite prayers and recipes in the same breath. You know how to reduce a swelling with cabbage leaves, how to bring on labor with a touch of rue and whisper. And you also know how quickly knowledge turns into suspicion. After all, what is a woman doing with so much information in her hands? Why does she always seem to know what's wrong before the priest even arrives? Why does she ask so many questions? And how does she remember so much? There's the academic debate. Were these women guardians of tradition or dangerous deviants, healers or heretics? The answer, as always, is yes. Both. Neither. It depends who's watching and what outcome you produce. You remember a girl from 2 villages over clever with poultices and herbs who disappeared after someone claimed she could see the illness before it came. You haven't seen her since Candlemas. No one talks about her. The truth is, the line between remedy and ritual is thin. So you measure carefully. You speak gently. You pretend not to know things you know too well. You brew a tea for the blacksmith's wife who hasn't bled in 3 months, and prays each night for the flow to return. You wrap the feet of a child fevered with chills, murmuring a rhyme under your breath that isn't quite a charm, but not quite not one either. At night, by tallow light, you mix powders into packets and label them with symbols only you and your teacher recognize. 1 for cough, 1 for night terrors, 1 for sorrow that won't lift. You do not call it magic, but sometimes it feels like it. You wonder if your touch might be remembered more for its mystery than its mercy. There's a curious detail, too. Some midwives were licensed, inspected by church officials, required to swear they would not use witchcraft or charms. Others weren't, and lived in the edges of society, halfway between revered and reviled. You walk that edge every day, nodding to the priest at market while slipping fennel into your pocket like contraband. The irony is almost laughable. When a noblewoman's labor goes sideways, the midwife is summoned, not the priest. When a peasant's child won't wake, they want you, not the bishop. But once the crisis passes, they forget. Or worse, they remember with fear. You've learned to be humble and quiet, not too helpful, not too brilliant, enough to be useful, never enough to be dangerous. Still the knowledge hums in your bones. Tonight you grind foxglove for a man coughing blood. You use just enough. Too much, and he'll sleep forever. Too little, and he'll die anyway. You measure by memory, by instinct, by a gut feeling older than Scripture. And in that act lies the thing they cannot name, but fear all the same power. Not loud, not flashing. Quiet, earthy power. The kind that grows from years of watching, listening, and never being believed until it's too late. So you pass your knowledge carefully, in baskets of dried herbs, in whispered instructions, in a touch of honey stirred into the wrong tea with the right intention. Your apprentice asks too many questions, and you love her for it. You teach her what your teacher taught you, that the body tells stories, that healing begins long before the fever breaks, that sometimes kindness is the strongest medicine. And you warn her gently not to speak too proudly, not to know too quickly, not because knowledge is bad, but because the world has not yet forgiven women for having it. So you carry on by moonlight and memory patching the sick and blessing the births. You keep records in your head and prayers in your mouth. And every so often, you smile at the irony that they'll write poems for the knights paint saints on chapel walls, but never carve your name into stone. You'll heal a dozen lives before anyone thanks you, and you'll still be the first blamed if something goes wrong. But for now, the basket is full, and the moon is rising. You head home a little heavier in the shoulders and lighter in the heart, because knowledge, though dangerous, is still yours. And tonight that's enough. You're sitting by the hearth, rubbing your sore feet with vinegar. Yes, vinegar, because it's supposed to draw out the humors, though it mostly just stings and makes you smell like salad. As the fire crackles and your hands warm, someone begins to tell a story. Not a real one, mind you, but one of those moral tales that get passed around like dried apples at a feast, tart, chewy, and slightly exaggerated. And in every one, it's the same, a woman at the center. She is either a beacon of virtue or a bubbling cauldron of sin. Sometimes both, often within the same paragraph. Here's the popular history for tonight. Medieval Europe adored a binary. Women were either saints or temptresses, martyrs or monsters. Think of the Virgin Mary on one side and Eve on the other, perfect obedience or the fall of man. No room for sort of trying her best. These weren't just theological abstractions. They filtered into everything: sermons, art songs, laws, and bedtime stories, if you were lucky enough to hear one. And oh, the stories they told about women. There's the tale of the virtuous maiden who resists temptation by leaping into a river and is instantly rewarded with sainthood. Then there's the woman who dares to speak her mind, ends up trampled by pigs, and is used as an example of what not to do for the next 3 centuries. It's all very subtle, of course. You start to notice how these stories are everywhere. The stained glass in the church shows female martyrs bleeding decoratively, while the men stand triumphantly in armor. The songs the children sing mock the washerwoman who talks too much. Even the herb woman who lives by the woods is rumored to have made a deal with the devil, because she knows what she's doing. Here's the side detail for the night vinegar wasn't just for feet. It was also used as a beauty treatment, a disinfectant, and occasionally, as a tool of piety, women would wash their faces in it to diminish vanity. Because heaven forbid your skin look too healthy. Someone might think you enjoy life. The deeper question here, and here's your academic debate of the evening, is this: were these tales effective social tools for control? Or do they reflect deeper unconscious anxieties about women's roles? Did people really believe them, or just find them convenient to repeat? Either way, the result was the same. A woman could be admired, but not too much. Praised, but not envied. Respected, but preferably dead. Holiness was safest in hindsight. So you start to laugh quietly, so no one thinks you're plotting something. Because you begin to see the pattern. A woman cures a fever suspicious. A woman spends her life in quiet prayer, saintly. A woman asks for more bread in the town council meeting unthinkable. You remember the old scribe who muttered under his breath that too much reading sours a woman's womb, as if knowledge were vinegar fermenting us from the inside. You'd be amused if it weren't so exhausting. What they never mention in the stories is the in-between. The thousands of women who weren't saints or sinners, but simply tired, who sewed hems by candlelight and told their daughters in whispers the names of herbs and the rules of survival, who lived without names in books but carried whole villages in their arms. You think about how many moral tales are just warnings wrapped in narrative. Don't speak too loud. Don't laugh too freely. Don't walk alone. And don't, above all else, question the story. But you do, because you know that some of the most dangerous women in medieval legend were also the most admired. Hildegard, with her visions and books. Joan, with her armor and fire. Even the unnamed abbess, who hid her books under floorboards when the bishop came calling. You think about how stories shape memory, so you begin to tell new ones. Not out loud, of course, but in your own way. You whisper them into dough as you need. You stitch them into seams with little knots that only your daughter will notice. You carve them into spoons. You etch them into the way you comfort a neighbor, or how you pause before repeating a rumor. Because you've learned that surviving a story is sometimes more important than starring in it. You watch the fire burn low and think about all the women who were blamed not for what they did, but for what they represented. Change, curiosity, doubt, desire. All those terribly human things made monstrous in the hands of men with quills. And you wonder, what tale are they telling about you? You hope it's one of quiet rebellion, of kindness mistaken for weakness, of laughter that doesn't need permission. You pull the vinegar-soaked cloth from your foot and toss it into the hearth. A small hiss, a puff of steam. Tomorrow, someone will start another tale. Maybe about a woman who knew too much, or smiled too little, or lived too long. But tonight you are warm and still and real, and that is enough. It's early morning, and you're already at work. The sheep have been shorn, the wool washed, and now your fingers dance through it, carding, spinning, weaving. Each thread carries more than warmth. It carries the weight of generations. You make cloth, not just for clothing, but for burial shrouds. Baptism swaddles altar cloths. A woman's hands, it seems, must always be busy, even in death. Tonight's common historical fact. Women's labor wasn't confined to the hearth. You might spin, but you might also brew ale, tend bees, help build thatched roofs, or even run a business if no man stops you first. The economy of any medieval village would collapse faster than a soggy wattle wall without women's work. But here's your strange detail. For the evening, in some areas, midwives were legally required to swear oaths before assisting birth oaths to report any suspicious murmuring from the laboring mother. Because, of course, pain makes you vulnerable. And a woman crying out in agony might also say something heresy adjacent. Childbirth was risky, but heresy, that could get everyone excommunicated. So you whisper. You always whisper. You whisper stories while you weave. You whisper encouragement while your sister sweats through labor beside the hearth. You whisper prayers, half-remembered charms, and practical advice all in one breath. Because to speak too clearly would draw attention, and attention never ends well. Here's a debate you don't hear in the town square, but it lingers under your skin. Did the church's suspicion of women's knowledge grow from genuine fear of magic, or from an unwillingness to admit that women knew anything at all? After all, a midwife might know more about life and death than a dozen monks, and yet she doesn't wear robes, doesn't sit in a scriptorium, doesn't get to write it down. But she does get blamed if the child is stillborn, or the mother bleeds too long, or the wind howls the wrong way during a baptism. It's a curious thing, You think that in a world where people believe demons can hide in spoons, a woman with rosemary and calm hands is the one called dangerous. You keep spinning. And as you do, you think of the bodies around you, your own sore from bending and lifting, your neighbors swollen with child, your grandmothers hunched but stubborn. Women's bodies in the medieval world are not their own. They are vessels for lineage, for duty, for piety. If a man is the head, the woman is the body, which means you are everything from the aching feet to the laboring womb. And if that's not holy, what is? There's no fresco for you on the church wall. No stained glass that shows a woman spinning under a thatched roof or holding her daughter's hand while she learns to braid straw for baskets. But you are there, in every corner. You're in the woven canopy over the altar, in the bread laid on the priest's plate, in the herbs that keep away the coughing sickness, in the linen strips that wrap the dying. You think of all the whispers that live in cloth warnings sewn into hems, comfort stitched into seams, secrets passed with needle and thread. Because when you cannot speak plainly, you speak sideways. So tonight, as you fold the cloth you've made, you whisper again. A story, maybe, or a name you want remembered. You fold carefully, as if the fibers themselves might carry memory, because they do. You smile quietly, of course, the way your grandmother did, the way your daughter will. The world may not carve your name in stone, but it wraps itself in what you make, and that too is power. The harvest is in, or mostly. It came late this year and light. You're counting sacks of barley with lips pressed thin, already calculating how thin the broth must become by February. It is not romantic, this part of medieval life. It is not a festival of abundance with tambourines and garlands. It is a slow subtraction, a math problem where hunger always wins by spring. Tonight's well-documented fact medieval diets were seasonal, sparse, and largely vegetarian by necessity, not choice. Meat was rare. Cheese was precious. Porridge and pottage ruled. And women, especially peasant women, managed food from soil to stomach. But here's a strange aside: in some villages, women brewed weak small beer, daily low in alcohol, but rich in calories, so their families could drink safely and fill their bellies without, well, actual food. You weren't drunk, just slightly foggy and hydrated enough to stay alive. You stir the pot again. The turnips have gone soft. You wonder if the mouse will get to them before you do. Not that you'd blame it, because what matters is keeping others fed. You hand your children the thickest crusts. You serve your husband first, not because of love or obedience, but because if he collapses, the oxen won't be yoked tomorrow. And if the oxen aren't yoked, the spring barley won't be planted. And if it's not planted, well, you know the rest. There's a debate here unspoken, but sharp. Is it sacrifice or survival when women feed others before themselves? Is it love or simply the learned rhythm of a world that asks too much and offers too little? You don't have time to answer. The fire's fading and you need to boil nettles before they wilt. What you know in your marrow is this: food equals power, but not the kind sung about in courtly ballads. Your power is quiet, strategic, measured in teaspoons and root cellars. You ration the salt with precision. You hide a few dried pears in your apron's deepest fold for a sick neighbor or a future fever. You save the marrow bones for soup when everyone else forgets they exist. You are not only feeding, You are managing an entire crisis economy daily with no silver, no parchment, and no title. Just instinct and a wooden spoon. When spring comes late, when blight hits the rye, when pigs sicken, or frost returns in April, who adjusts? You do. You swap recipes with the other women recipes that are half prayer, half chemistry. You learn which weeds to boil, which bark you can chew in desperation, which grains can stretch a stew and still fool a growling stomach. And still, you get blamed when someone falls ill. A spoiled stew. Maybe she hexed it. A child's bellyache. Did she gather the wrong root? A husband's slow wasting? Is she slipping something into his cup? So you stir. And you keep your head down. And you pretend not to know that everyone eats because of you. The priest praises providence. The Lord praises his bounty. The neighbors nod politely, but none of them sees you sneaking to the hedgerow for hawthorn berries, or bartering a thimble of lard for one clean egg. You do that. You make meals from memory and miracle. You carry generations not just in your womb, but in your hands, kneading, scraping, boiling, and never quite full. You tuck away crumbs for a cold night. You whisper a charm over the stew, not because you believe it will work, but because it's the only thing left you can still say out loud. And then you serve. Always serve. Always last. Because when the food runs out, you'll be the one who remembers how to keep going. Not because you're unbreakable, but because you're needed. And that is its own kind of cruel holiness. You wake to the sound of coughing. Not your own. Not tonight, but one of the children, the little one, the one you swaddled just last spring in a shawl that was once your grandmother's apron. It's always the little ones, isn't it? Their lungs like damp linen always catching the cold the wind never forgets to bring. Here's a fact that sits heavy in medieval Europe. 1 in every 3 children didn't make it past their 5th birthday, and mothers, many didn't live to see more than half of their own born children grow up. But the world didn't pause for grief. It barely blinked. You bury your dead and boil the porridge in the same breath. Now for something oddly tender in all this, there were hand-carved cradles, passed down not just through generations, but between neighbors. One woman's child outgrows it, and the next expectant mother receives it sometimes with an embroidered cloth stitched by a line of women you'll never meet, but somehow already know. The cradle holds more than babies. It holds stories, hopes, and far too many silences. Here's the uncomfortable question that scholars still ask: did medieval women fear childbirth more than death itself? The records of midwives say little perhaps, because the pain was simply expected, like rain in March or frost in October. You certainly don't speak of it, not in the field, not by the hearth. But you know the names of the herbs you're not supposed to know. You whisper them anyway. Pennyroyal, mugwort, rue. Sometimes for healing, sometimes for other reasons you don't admit to yourself until it's too late. You keep a small pouch tied beneath your shift. Inside, sage leaves a bit of chamomile, a dried sliver of something no one can quite identify anymore. It smells of earth and hope. When labor comes, it comes like a tide. No stopping it. No bargaining. You grip the edge of the wooden stool knees, parted, surrounded by women, always. Women who speak softly, sometimes chant. You are both heroine and hostage in this moment. You remember all the stories whispered in the dark. How pain was Eve's punishment. How Mary suffered in silence. How your cousin bled for 2 days and was buried before her child took its second breath. But no one says those things out loud now. They hand you a cloth soaked in rosemary water. They press your forehead. They pray, or hum, or weep. It doesn't matter. Your body doesn't wait for ceremony. It opens, it breaks, it bleeds, and it delivers. And then you pray yourself. Not for gratitude, but that this time maybe the baby stays. The midwife nods, tired but gentle. She wraps the child tight like a secret you hope no storm can steal. But you've already lost two. And so you watch this one breathe. Again and again. Until the night no longer feels dangerous. Still the cradle and the coffin sit too close together in your mind. You dream of making them farther apart. But dreams are costly, and time is brutal. You breastfeed while kneeling by the hearth. You press your ear to their chest at night just to be sure. You stay awake too long and rise too early, because if anyone's going to keep this tiny miracle alive, it's you. When the neighbors come to visit, they nod, they smile, they ask if he's a strong feeder. No one asks how you are. It wouldn't matter if they did. You wouldn't answer honestly, because part of being a medieval woman is this: you learn to cry silently. Even when your body is loud, you clean the swaddling cloth with boiling water. You mutter a charm you half remember. You feed everyone else before yourself again. And when the child coughs at dawn, you close your eyes and pretend it's just the fire's smoke. Because you mustn't go there yet. Not again. But in the candlelight, you find your strength not in denial, but in routine. The cradle must be rocked. The porridge must be stirred. The grave must be dug if it comes to that with your own hands. You carry generations, not just through your body, but through memory, through song, through the way you fold a cloth, the way you shush a child, the way you light the morning fire, as though your whole lineage depends on it, because it does. And somehow, through all the grief, you still manage to love, to sing, to rock the cradle and pray over the coffin and begin again. Tonight you're mixing something in a bowl. Not for bread, not this time. It's a gray paste ground from dried moss beeswax and a pinch of whatever that herb is your aunt used to dry by the chimney. You never asked what she called it. She never said. But it worked when your cousin got boils from the river water. You spread it on a linen square, fold the corners neatly, and tuck it away in your basket beneath the potatoes. If anyone asks, it's just food for the pig. Let's be honest, there's a reason medieval women were so often accused of knowing too much. Because you do know things. Things about pain. Things about healing. Things about life that don't fit into church sermons or tax records. Here's a truth. Historians now grudgingly admit many peasant women were unofficial physicians. They knew their herbs better than the parish priest knew his Latin. And yet, every time something went wrong, a dying child, a spoiled harvest, a man who simply couldn't perform, someone whispered the same word: witch. The scholarly debate is sharp. Here were these women, dangerous, or just dangerously competent, and you never even claimed to be anything but helpful. You wrap your hands in a cloth soaked with vinegar to soothe the burns from yesterday's hearth. You rub garlic oil on a swollen ankle. You mash honey with dried mint to quiet a cough, and by morning, the whole family breathes easier. But you never say out loud what you know, because the line between healer and heretic is paper thin. Sometimes it's just a matter of who's watching. And sometimes you want to believe you have more power than you do. When your friend's child doesn't wake, you sneak into the woods alone, burying bits of rosemary and whispering a name into the moss. Not magic, not quite. Just grief with rhythm. Once you dried a frog's leg because someone said it might stop nosebleeds. It didn't. But still, you keep it just in case. There's a strange pride in your knowledge. You know when the moon shifts. You know which berries not to pick. You can feel the difference in the air before rain. That's not mystery. It's just paying attention. But others don't see it that way. The bailiff's wife gives you side eyes whenever her child runs a fever and your name gets mentioned. Too helpful, they whisper. Too quiet. Too quick with a cure. Too unmarried. Too clever. Too something. Your own mother taught you most of this before you were 10. How to measure dried root by fingertip. How to test water temperature with your wrist. How to tell fever dreams from spiritual visions. But she also taught you never to tell anyone where you learned it, so you don't. Instead, you bake your poultices into pies if need be. You pretend not to notice when your neighbors knock too late at night offering excuses. It's not for me, it's for my brother's wife's sister's baby. Of course it is. You smile, hand them the bottle, and close the door quietly. And when that same neighbor avoids your gaze, the next market day, you say nothing. Because your power is soft. It has to be. You dream sometimes of a room, with shelves, real ones, lined with jars labeled in ink. A place where you could speak freely, experiment openly, and not hide your dried marigold petals behind old rags. But this world is not that room, so you wait for night. You do your best work by candlelight anyway. The irony, of course, is that the men in the manor depend on women like you. You're the one they call when the cow won't give milk, when the wound festers, when the baby cries through the night. But heaven forbid they thank you. And yet you don't stop. Because survival in this century is its own form of science. And you're not some mystic in a tale. You're a mother, a midwife, a field hand, a cook, and sometimes a little bit of a miracle worker. And when the seasons turn and the blood returns and someone says, "It's just nature," you nod. Because nature to you is not just rivers and trees. It's knowing exactly when to light a fire, how to stitch a cut without thread, how to sing the fever out. You don't need recognition, just enough peace to keep your mortar dry and your secrets alive. Because in a world where women are punished for knowing too little and feared for knowing too much, you've mastered the art of being just enough. Just enough to keep them alive. And just clever enough to keep yourself breathing one healing at a time. There's a whisper in the rafters tonight, and it's not just the wind through the thatch. It's you, humming to yourself an old tune with no lyrics, the kind passed down from one woman's mouth to another's ear, soft as a lullaby, sharp as a warning. You're older now. Not old, but old enough to see how the threads tie together. You still haul water. You still bake. You still know which roots to dry and which mushrooms to avoid unless you're feeling a little reckless. But more than anything, you've come to recognize the weight of things not said, because in your time, you've seen what happens to women who know too much. And you've seen what happens to women who say nothing at all. There was that girl, the one with the quick fingers and clever drawings. The village priest said her ink-smudged hands were a sign of vanity. You helped her clean them with crushed lavender and goat milk. Then you helped her hide her drawings under a false bottom in the grain chest. You still remember her sketches. One looked suspiciously like a diagram of the female body. Another was a flower blooming from a skull. She disappeared after a bad winter, People said she ran away. You're not so sure. The truth is, you've become a vault. Women bring you things, memories, warnings, recipes, letters they can't read. You keep them all. Not because you're a hoarder of secrets. Because if you don't, who will? And now you've started teaching a younger one, your cousin's daughter maybe, or just a neighbor girl whose questions never stop. She watches your hands more than your mouth. She knows better than to ask directly, but she knows you'll show her. Quietly. You teach her where the nettle grows. You teach her how to read time by the shadow of the well. You teach her how to keep silence not just as a rule, but as a kind of sacred art. Sometimes you see her writing things in the dirt with a stick. She brushes it away quickly. You pretend not to notice, but you do. Because once you were her, and once someone let you in on a secret, that was the thing the world never understood. Women didn't need formal books to pass on knowledge. They wrote with needle and thread. They etched wisdom into dough. They wrapped it in songs no man thought to memorize. And now it lives in you. In the way you tuck a cloth. In the way you answer without speaking. In the way you survive. There are moments when you wonder if it's enough. Will it last? Will it outlive the men who scoff at it, the priests who fear it, the records that forget it? And then the girl comes back the next morning with a bruise on her arm and asks if vinegar and thyme might help. You don't say anything poetic. You just nod and reach for the jar. Because the knowledge hasn't vanished. It's never gone, not really. It lives in the movements of your fingers. It lives in the whispered advice passed between bent heads at the well. It lives in the lullabies with curious harmonies no man understands. It lives every time a woman chooses not to forget. So tonight, as you lay your head down on straw, on linen on earth, you carry more than your own body. You carry centuries of women who were punished for knowing too much. And you carry the quiet joy of knowing they were never truly silenced. Not really. Not if you're still here breathing, remembering passing it on. You wake again to the darkness, not the soft kind that invites dreams, but the kind that clings like damp wool. The embers have gone cold. No one tells the fire to burn. Just like no one tells you to rise before the cock crows and tend to it, but you do. Because that's what the women in your family have always done. You pull your shawl tighter around your shoulders, shuffle barefoot across the earthen floor, and crouch near the hearth. The ashes are pale and stiff with night. You nudge them with the tip of the iron poker, half hoping for a spark to blink back at you. None do, so you start again. A twist of straw. A breath held close to the coals. A whispered curse that you'd never let the children hear. The straw catches, crackles, and grows. You cup your hand, gently guarding the flame, like it's a baby bird you've rescued from the cold. Because it is, in a way. This fire is life. You can hear the others still sleeping. Their breaths rise and fall in soft rhythms, like old songs passed down by grandmothers. And here you are, tending to the breath of the house. Again, no one will thank you. No one even notices most mornings. But if the fire ever failed to start, oh, then they'd notice. Then they'd feel it in their bones. That's how it often is for women like you. You carry warmth invisibly until the warmth is gone, and suddenly everyone remembers they're cold. The kettle groans on its hook. You add a few sticks from the bundle you gathered yesterday, the ones still wet from frost despite the thatch roof. They hiss, but surrender slowly to the heat. In the flickering light, you stretch your back and glance around the room. It's still quiet. The baby hasn't stirred yet. Neither has your husband. Or your mother-in-law, who sleeps as lightly as a bird and dreams as sharply as a blade. You take a moment, just one. You let yourself sit there, watching the fire bloom, letting the heat lick your knuckles and warm the ache in your hands. There's a saying in your village, if the fire's fed, the day begins. And it's almost poetic if you weren't the one always feeding it. They don't write ballads about women who keep the fire alive. But they should, because the fire doesn't keep itself lit, and neither does the world. Your mind drifts as the light grows. You think of your grandmother's hands bent like old branches, always busy with something. She used to sit by the hearth, shelling peas, mending socks, boiling roots into cures for coughs she could hear before anyone else did. She said the fire was her memory, that it held everything. Secrets, sorrows, stories. She swore the crackles were the voices of women who came before. You believe her now more than ever, because when you sit here in the dark before the day begins, you hear them too. Not words, not exactly, but something that lingers, something that insists we did this. So can you. Your eldest daughter will be up soon. She'll pretend not to be tired the way girls do when they want to seem grown. She'll ask if there's bread, even though she knows the answer. There's no flour left until the next trade, and the hens have gone lazy in the cold. Still, you'll make something. You always do. Porridge again. With a scrape of dried fruit, if you can find it. You ladle water into the pot, set it to hang low over the flames, and wipe your hands on your apron. The smell of smoke clings to everything, your clothes, your skin, even your thoughts. You don't mind. Smoke is the perfume of survival. Behind you, someone stirs. Your youngest, maybe. He'll come padding over in his too big tunic, rubbing his eyes, asking for warmth. You'll scoop him into your lap and hold him near the fire. You always do. And as you sit there, his head against your collarbone, your hands wrapped around him like a prayer, you wonder if one day he'll remember this. Not your name, perhaps, or the exact shape of your face, but the warmth, the fire, the feeling of being safe when the world outside is cold and dark. That's what women pass down, isn't it? Not just blood, but warmth, a place to land, a silence full of comfort, a dawn that begins because someone woke up first, someone like you. And even if no one writes it down, even if no one says, she was the reason we didn't freeze this morning, you'll know. Because the fire is lit, because the pot is warming, because someone will eat today, and someone else will be held. And even if history forgets your name, your labor is the reason it kept going. The baby stirs, the rooster crows. Your mother-in-law clears her throat with that sound that means she's about to complain about the wind, and you smile, because the day has begun, and you lit it, quietly, like always, and just maybe. In the crackle of the fire, you hear your grandmother say, "Well done." You start with the barley, always the barley. The grain is stubborn and dry, stored in a canvas sack tucked beneath the bench, where the mice can't reach it, at least not without effort. You measure it out with the same carved wooden scoop your mother used and her mother before her. It's worn smooth at the edges from years of repetition. You could measure in your sleep. Sometimes you think you do. The fire is still holding on from earlier, bless it. So you stoke it gently and set the pot to warm. The water inside murmurs quietly, like it knows what's coming. There's no feast today, but there is food. Because you've made something from nothing before. You always do. A pinch of salt from the corner of the shelf. A shaving of yellowed root vegetable that still smells faintly of earth. A few withered herbs from the bunch you dried months ago and almost forgot. You stir the pot with practiced rhythm. Round and round. Clockwise like your grandmother taught you. Always stir with the sun, she'd say, or the food won't listen. You used to laugh at that, but now you stir with the sun. Because why risk it? Behind you, the house is waking. Children, dragging their feet toward the promise of warmth. Your husband, muttering something about rain. A neighbor girl. Why is she here again, so early, peeking in the door with her empty bowl and hopeful eyes? You nod to her. Of course, because feeding people doesn't stop at your doorstep. It spreads like heat, like stories, like you. You ladle out portions with quiet precision. The smallest one for yourself. It's always been that way. Not out of martyrdom, though some might call it that, but because you know how far hunger can reach, and you'd rather it stop with you. Someone asks where the honey is. You blink. Honey. You haven't seen honey since midsummer, when the bees were drunk on lavender, and the sky had the softness of butter. Now, it's all ash and frost. There is no honey. There's boiled grain and warm air, and the sound of spoons scraping bowls, and somehow that's enough. You sit at the edge of the hearth, cup in hand, and breathe in the steam. It smells like survival. Not joy, perhaps, not comfort, not luxury, but survival. And that's wholly enough. They don't write saints' lives about women who stirred porridge through the centuries, but maybe they should. Because you've witnessed more small miracles over this pot than in any church nave. The way a sick child eats again after days of refusing. The way an argument quiets as soon as the food is served. The way your daughter once whispered, "It tastes like home," with her mouth still full. Those are your holy relics. Crumbs and breath and soot and sighs. All stirred into something warm. Something that says, you are not alone. You clean up with swift efficiency. There's always something else to do. Always. You wipe the spoons with the edge of your apron, rinse the pot, with leftover water from the kettle, hang the rag to dry by the door. Your back aches, but it's a familiar ache. The kind that tells you the world is still turning, and you helped it along its way. You step outside for a moment. Just a moment. The air is cold and wet, the kind that settles into your bones and doesn't leave until spring. The chickens are already scratching near the compost, hoping for worms. You envy them, not for their lives, heavens no, but for their single-mindedness. Food, warmth, rest. They ask for nothing more. You wish you could. Instead, your mind spins with lists. What needs mending? Who needs comforting? How long the dried beans might last? Whether the smokehouse roof will make it through another storm. You are a ledger no one reads, a book of balances, of portions, of quiet calculations made by hand and heart. Once long ago, you asked your mother if men ever carried this weight. She laughed not unkindly and said, "They carry it in the field. We carry it in the hearth, and in the belly, and in the silence between bites." You didn't understand then. Now you do, because this isn't just cooking. It's remembering. It's inventing. It's stretching 4 apples into enough sweetness for 6 people. It's turning yesterday's crusts into tonight's soup. It's nourishment as negotiation. Diplomacy by ladle, peace maintained over porridge. You glance toward the roof, where the smoke curls lazily from the chimney. Another neighbor might smell it and remember their own hunger. They'll come. And you'll find a way to feed them too, because that's what women like you have always done. Not because you're saints, not because you're heroes, but because if you don't, no one else will. And even if no one notices, even if no one sings of you in taverns or writes your name in a monk's margin, you'll keep stirring, keep feeding, keep warming what the world forgets to hold, because the porridge doesn't make itself, and neither does the peace. Your needle is small, your thread is short, and yet somehow this is how you hold the world together. You don't think of yourself as a weaver of fate or a spinner of myth, but here you are again, with your lap full of fabric, your fingers sore, your shoulders tight from hunching in the dark. And this hem must be finished before the baby wakes, or before the sun does, whichever comes first. You work by the hearth, the last coals glowing just enough to see the difference between thread and shadow. Your thimble is made of bone. It was your aunt's. She said it saved her thumb during wartime and her pride during peacetime. You're not sure which was harder. The children sleep behind you in a bundle of wool and breath. Your husband snoring like thunder beneath the thatch. But you stitch because the tunic tore again. Because someone's sleeve unraveled. Because a neighbor's baby will need wrapping. Because no one else will notice until it's done. And if it's not done, they'll notice that. You loop and pull, loop and pull. And with every motion you think not in words, but in echoes. The seamstress who taught you to count stitches. The midwife who taught you to count breaths. The old widow who taught you to count silence as a kind of answer. Needle in, needle out. It's a meditation more than a task. And like so many things you do, it leaves no record, only results. A mended hem, a wearable shirt, a family clothed for one more winter. No one thanks you for it, but you don't need them to. You know what you've done and what you've saved. The door creaks, not from wind, but from her. Your eldest daughter barefoot and bleary-eyed. She rubs her face and leans against the wall watching you. You smile, not wide, not with teeth, just enough to say, "Come sit." She does. You hand her the second needle. She grumbles. You chuckle. She'll learn. Not because you demand it, but because the world will. And this thread, it's one of the few things you can pass on without fear of it being stolen or broken or forgotten in a dowry. She fumbles with the knot. You guide her fingers, like tying a promise you whisper. She rolls her eyes, but she listens. You think about your own mother. How she used to sew through the night, before feast days, adding ribbons she couldn't afford, and embroidery she didn't have time for. Not for vanity, but for dignity. For the pride of being clean and whole in a world that wanted you tattered. You remember the feel of those clothes, how they made you walk straighter, speak softer, as if the stitch work itself carried your mother's voice in every seam. You hope your daughter feels that now. She pricks her finger, yelps. You offer the hem of your apron. She wipes it. You don't flinch. Blood washes out. Most things do. Outside, the wind picks up. It presses against the shuttered window, rattling the frame like an old warning. Winter is almost here. You can smell it. In the cold creeping through the floor, in the silence between gusts, you glance toward the basket of clothes beside you. Still more to patch, still more to prepare. You sigh, but it's soft, resigned, rhythmic, because this is what women do. Across borders and generations, they mend, they prepare, they soften the sharpness of the world with thread and fabric and love that doesn't shout. They repair things no one sees, break. They make use of scraps no one else values. They turn the leftover, the torn, the forgotten, into something warm, something wearable, something whole. Your daughter has finished her first line of stitches. They're crooked, but earnest. You nod. She beams. The world shifts a little. In a good way. You lay the garment gently aside. Pull out the next one. A sleeve ripped at the elbow. It belonged to your cousin's boy. He'll need it for the winter market. He's proud, too. Would never ask. But the rip was wide and ugly. So you took it when he wasn't looking. You thread your needle again. The bone thimble fits over your finger like a secret ring. You think of all the hands like yours. Across the kingdom, across time, mending in the dark. Not for glory, not for praise, but because there's work to be done and warmth to be shared. The baby stirs. Your daughter rises blanket in hand. You nod again. She swaddles her sibling like it's second nature. It is. You taught her, not with words, but with the thread. Always the thread. And in that moment, so quiet, so ordinary, so easy to forget, you realize this is how generations survive. Not just by births and deaths, but by all the work in between. The things no one writes down, the stitches no one counts, the warmth that comes from women who sit beside dying fires with needles in hand and daughters at their side. You've been up since before the bell rang for lauds, but this time not for bread or babies or broken sleeves. This time it's for death. Not yours, not yet, but close enough. The old woman in the cottage by the edge of the orchard, the one who once sang lullabies that didn't need words, has finally gone. Not loudly, not messily, just slipped out like the last candle guttering in a chapel that's long since emptied. And now the women gather, not to weep, not exactly, but to prepare, because before the priest ever mutters his Latin, before the earth is turned or the soul is blessed, there is work to do. And it is women's work. You step into her house quietly, as if she might still be sleeping. The air is thick with old time and dust. She lies on the bed in her best shift, one hand curled over the other, like she's holding something invisible. No one speaks at first. Even the chickens outside seem to know this is a moment to tread softly. Your aunt begins with the window. Open just a crack to let the soul find its way. Then comes the cloth for her face, the gentle folding of her hands, the washing of feet. It is tender, not sad. Like bathing a baby, but backward. You're handed a wooden bowl, lukewarm water swirling in it. The cloth is rough, but clean. You begin with her forehead. Wipe gently. She always had a high brow, smooth even in old age. You once asked her if she'd ever plucked it like the younger women did. She laughed and said vanity was for the living. You remember her laugh now. It lingers, almost enough to make you smile. Almost. Your hands move on their own now. Neck, arms, fingers. She has rings, simple and dull with time. One of you will keep them for the family. Maybe. Or maybe they'll be slipped into her pocket for the journey. You're not supposed to talk about that. Next comes the hair. Comb gently. She still smells of rosemary. She always did. Said it kept away bad thoughts. You believed her. And neighbor brings the shroud. It's plain linen soft from years of washing. She made it herself. Years ago. Most women do. It waits in the bottom chest, just beneath the winter cloak, and the baby shoes no longer needed. As you wrap her, you realize something quiet and enormous she's still giving. Even now, her last act wasn't speaking. It was preparing, because she knew what the next women would need. Not the priest, not the lords, not even the sons, but the women, the ones who would wash, wrap, whisper. You pull the shroud smooth over her chest and feel the shift in the room. A kind of settling. The kind that happens when something hard has been done well. Like smoothing flour with your palm. Like folding the last corner of a sheet. She is ready. And now comes the memory. Not the grand speeches or the ink-stained chronicles. Those belong to men, to kings, to clerics. But her legacy is here. In the hands that learned from her hands. In the recipe still whispered for nettle broth when the meat runs out. In the way you tie your apron. In the way you hum when you scrub a pot. You remember how she sat at your mother's bedside through every birth. Never loud, never afraid. Just there, steady as stone, warm as soup. You remember how she healed a boil with garlic, how she whispered stories of saints who had freckles and crooked toes, how she told you once that no woman leaves the world without leaving a map inside someone else, that someone is you now. You help carry the body to the bench by the hearth. It is not the altar of a church, but it is sacred. This is where she fed strangers, scolded grandchildren, blessed the sick. Later, the priest will come. He'll sprinkle water. He'll say words. He'll look important. But right now, the holiest work has already been done. The kettle is set to boil, not for grief, but for comfort. You bring out mugs, the kind she liked, a little chipped. Still good. One by one, the women gather closer. No wailing, no dramatics, just stories. Soft ones, silly ones. The kind that only makes sense if you knew her. The kind that will disappear unless you speak them now. You listen. You smile. You add your own. And as you do, you realize something strange. Grief feels less like a hole and more like a full basket. Heavy? Yes. But full, and you will carry it, as women always have, not because it's expected, but because it's necessary. Because remembering is a form of resistance. Because stories are how the dead survive. And because when your time comes, and it will, you hope someone remembers how you liked your tea and what song you hummed when mending sleeves. And that once, on a cold morning like this one, you were the one who helped send a soul on its way. The candles are low again, not because they've burned down, but because you've pinched the wicks yourself, saving what little light you have for when it's most needed, when someone stumbles in with a bloody thumb, or when the baby wakes screaming and you need to check for fever. You've learned to see in the dark anyway. The firelight is enough to stitch by most nights, enough to find your way from cradle to kettle, Enough to read someone's expression, even when their words betray nothing. But not enough to read. Not that it matters. You were never taught. Books in your world are rare as kindness from a tax collector and twice as expensive. They're chained to pulpits or tucked into the pockets of priests, not passed into the hands of women like you. But memory that you have in abundance. You remember things the way other people store onions in layers and braids in dark corners of the house where no one else thinks to look. You remember who was born during the last frost and who was buried just before it. Who once whispered a recipe for fever wine into your ear in the middle of Lent. Who limped after falling from the old oak tree as a child, and who still does. You are a living archive, whether you chose to be or not, and you carry it all. Tonight, you sit by the hearth, one foot curled under the other, a pot of lentils bubbling just loud enough to remind you not to forget them. Someone has asked again, how long to boil barley before it won't give anyone the runs? And without even pausing your stitch, you answer. Because of course, you remember. No one gave you a book. But you learned with your hands, your mouth, your ears. The woman who taught you how to make salve from sheep fat and rosemary is dead now. But her voice lives in your muscle memory. So does the sound of her laugh, dry and scratchy like wind through old leaves. You pass these things on sometimes without knowing. A girl asked you last week, why do you press linen soaked in honey onto a sore? And you said, because it works, which is true, but also because someone once told you to, and someone told her. And before that, maybe someone carved it onto a wax tablet, or painted it onto a wall that's long since crumbled. But it lived, and now it lives in you. You pause your sewing to stir the pot. The lentils are softening. You add a pinch of dried sage from the cloth pouch beside you. It smells like memory. Sharp, bitter, grounded. They say history is written by the victors. But that's only if you think of history as something with ink and dates. In your world, history is whispered. Between women, over wells, beside cradles, at the edge of fields when your hands are too busy for anything else but your mind still wander. Sometimes it's a warning, don't plant garlic too early, or it'll rot in the ground. Sometimes it's a comfort rub marjoram on your temples for grief. Sometimes it's just something someone said once that stuck, like if the midwife hums while tying the cord, the child won't cry much in life. You don't know if it's true, but you hum anyway, because that's how knowledge moves in your world, not in straight lines, but in spirals. It circles. It sings. It settles where it's needed and waits to be remembered. And you are its keeper. No one thanks you for this. In fact, sometimes they scold you for knowing too much. A priest once said that women's tongues were dangerous when not bridled with silence. You bit yours that day, not out of submission, but out of exhaustion. Because if they think you speak too much, they've never heard what you keep to yourself. You once saw a girl turn blue in childbirth, and you remembered what the old woman said about blowing mugwort smoke under the bed. It worked. She lived. You never spoke of it again. Because sometimes the price of sharing is higher than the cost of silence. Still you store the story. Not to boast, not to teach, just because that's what women do. We carry things. In our arms, in our aprons, in our memories. We are the shelves no one built, the scrolls no one copied. You think of your own mother now long gone. She never taught you to read a word, but she taught you how to read everything else. How to tell when the wind meant rain. How to know a man was lying by the way he fiddled with his boot. How to feel the first signs of your own sickness days before it blooms. And when she was dying, she told you the things she'd never said while living. Who your grandfather truly loved. Where she buried the keepsake box. How to find the herb that grows only under yew trees and only during a full moon. You wrote it all down, not on parchment, but in the walls of your ribs. It's still there. You tap your chest now, as if to knock on that hidden door. Still solid, still stored. The girl who asked about the barley sits beside you now. She doesn't speak, just watches your hands. You don't tell her you've already been teaching her for years in how you move, in what you do first, in what you never do twice. This is what they'll never understand, those who measure knowledge in scrolls and seals. That wisdom has always lived in bodies, especially the bodies of women. Your hands ache a little tonight. The cold is setting in early, but you don't stop sewing. The hem must be mended before the morning. The pot must be stirred again. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you're remembering the lines of a song your aunt sang when she thought you were asleep. You don't know why it comes now, but it does. And you hum, quietly. Because even if no one else is listening, the memory is. And that is enough. That has always been enough. You've stopped 5 arguments today, and it's not even Vespers. First, it was the 2 boys fighting over a chipped wooden horse behind the barn. Then the woman next door and her sister-in-law, tossing sharp words, like stones over whose turn it was to feed their father. And just now, barely 10 minutes ago, you had to pull your own cousin aside before she called the widow across the road. Something neither of them could take back. You don't carry a sword. You don't raise your voice. But somehow, you keep the peace. Or at least, you keep the village from boiling over. You are the thread between tempers. And no one writes that in the chronicles. No one lights a candle in the church for the one who convinced 2 neighbors to share a broken hoe, or for the woman who stitched up a quarrel faster than a wound. But you know it's holy work. You know because when peace unravels, it's almost always women who are left to gather the pieces. You grew up watching your mother step between men with clenched fists and women with H-bitten tongues. You learned the power of saying just enough and not one word more. You saw how your grandmother used a bowl of broth and an offhand joke to stop a years-old grudge from catching flame again. It's not magic, though sometimes it feels like it. It's just noticing things. Like who brings their grief in their eyebrows, who hides fury in their knitting, who sighs too loudly when someone mentions a name from last autumn. Your ears are always half open, even when you're kneading dough or peeling turnips, because you have to be. Peace here is not a gift. It's a task, a constant tending, and you are its quiet steward. You've learned how to phrase things just so, softening accusations into questions, turning tension into curiosity. You speak in the spaces between pride and shame, where people are more willing to listen. No one asked you to do this, but if you stopped, you suspect the cracks would widen faster than the thatch roof in March. Even the priest once pulled you aside, not to praise, of course, but to gently suggest you discourage gossip among the women. You smiled. You always smile. But you also remember how he'd come to you 2 winters ago, asking for help when his sister refused to marry the man he'd chosen for her. You didn't judge. You simply asked what she was afraid of. And you listened. Sometimes that's all it takes. Other times it takes warm bread shared in silence, or a reminder of last summer's storm when the only way through was together. Still, this work tires you in a way your muscles don't understand, because it's not just about mending what's broken. It's about holding together what might break tomorrow. You often wake with your jaw sore from clenching dreams, thick with whispered insults that never reach the surface. And yet every day you rise, you wash your face, you smooth your hair, you brace yourself like a beam beneath the rafters of the household. They don't call it leadership. They call it being helpful. They don't say you hold power. They say you're so good at calming people. But you know what you're doing. You are shaping the space in which everyone else breathes. You are drawing the map of what will be remembered kindly, because it's not just about settling the moment. It's about what gets passed on. Children repeat the stories they hear, so you make sure they're good ones. You say things like, "Your uncle means well, he's just grieving differently." You murmur, "She's not cruel, just afraid." You remind the girl who wants to run away that her mother once had the same look in her eyes and stayed anyway and made something good out of it. You don't erase anyone's pain, but you soften its edges, and you plant gentler seeds. You once heard a friar say that women aren't suited for diplomacy, and you nearly laughed out loud, because if they only knew, you've negotiated more truces with a loaf of rye and a knowing glance than any knight with a quill and a seal. You've learned to bend like the willow because breaking serves no one. You've carried grudges for others until they could safely set them down. And yes, some nights you weep, not because of one big thing, but because of the weight of holding so many small ones. You cry quietly into a sleeve, into a cold pillow, and no one sees. But the next day, you carry on, because someone has to. Because peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the quiet decision over and over to try again. And no one is better at trying again than you. No songs will be written for you. No saint's feast will bear your name. But if there is harmony in this house, if the children play without fear, if the elders rest without bitterness, if the fire stays lit long into the night, it is because of you. And in that soft, unrecorded legacy, there is something stronger than fame. There is memory. There is love. There is you. And you are still holding it all together. Even now. Even here. Quietly. Steadily. Beautifully. You're sewing by candlelight again. It's late, though. You've stopped counting the hours after the moon passed the chimney's shadow. The children have long since gone to bed, curled together, like kittens under patched wool. The fire is mostly ash now, still warm, still glowing, but no longer urgent. Only the steady pull of the needle gives the night its shape. In and out. In and out. And with each stitch, a thought, not always full sentences, just impressions, glimpses, the feeling of a baby's weight before it cries, the sound of a husband's boots when he's in a bad mood, the smell of barley cooking too long on a distracted day, the memory of a sister now buried her laugh still tucked in the corners of your mind like folded linen. This is your peace. Quiet, but never empty, because even now, with no one awake to see it, you're carrying more than thread through cloth. You're carrying the weight of a life lived in the spaces between stories. You won't be written down in the books. Your name will not appear in the records kept by monks with ink-stained fingers. You did not lead armies. You did not break empires. You did not sit on thrones, but you held a household together when there was no bread and no rain, and no one left to hope but you. You boiled bitter roots and made them sweet with patience. You pressed your hand to a fevered brow and whispered prayers no one taught you. You made miracles in silence and then returned to scrubbing the floor. That is your legacy, not a crown, not a song, but the long invisible thread of care that bound your world together. Others might forget, but the walls remember. The stone floor you knelt on to soothe a frightened child. The wooden beam you leaned against when your back ached from chopping winter kindling. The spoon worn smooth from feeding more mouths than anyone counted. Even the old pewter cup knows your hands shaped by time and tenderness and repetition. If someone ever asks what women did in the Middle Ages, tell them this: you endured. You stitched generations into place. You kissed bruises and salted porridge and buried the dead with grace. You listened when no one else would. You stood in doorways, watching, waiting warning. You rocked babies who weren't yours. You taught songs that outlived you. You swallowed your thoughts when silence was survival, and you let them out again when the room was safe. You didn't have the luxury of rebellion. Most days, you didn't even have the luxury of rest. But you had resilience, and that was holy. Sometimes you wonder if anyone will remember what it felt like, this life of small movements and long shadows. The ache of waking before the sun to light a fire. The guilt of resting too long when the field needed weeding. The way your name was never spoken with reverence, but always with expectation. Where is she? She'll know. She'll fix it. And you always did. They called it duty, or modesty, or just woman's work. But it was more than that. It was the fabric of life, woven in kitchens and birthing rooms and late-night mending circles. And now, in this quiet hour, you finally let yourself breathe. You fold the fabric gently, smoothing the wrinkles with the palm of your hand. It doesn't matter that no one will see the final stitches. You know they're there. You know what they meant. Your candle flickers. The room sways in amber shadows. You think of your mother's hands, rough, quick, always warm. You think of the old widow who first taught you how to keep the fire alive with just a coal and a breath. You think of the girl you once were, the one who dreamed of riding horses, not stirring porridge, and you smile not with regret, but with recognition. She's still here, tucked under layers of wool and wisdom. She still dreams, though the dreams are softer now, quieter, like prayers said under your breath when no one is listening, but someone is always listening. Even if it's only the night, even if it's only the next woman to come along and find your stitching still holding strong after 100 years. You stand slowly back stiff, but heart steady. You cover the candle with a cupped hand, letting darkness settle gently over the room like a blanket. And you walk to your bed, not because your work is done, but because it never really is. It just sleeps when you do. Tonight, you lie down, knowing you've held the world in your arms and called it supper comfort home. You were never the story, but you were the reason it could be told. And somewhere, centuries from now, a girl will wonder who first taught the world to bend without breaking. And the answer will be you, still whispering, still mending, still carrying, even now. So now, as the firelight flickers lower and the shadows stretch long across the wooden beams, you let the day settle. The rough fabric beneath your hands, the scent of dried sage on the windowsill, the creak of the roof beams. These are the quiet companions of your life. You've walked through stories not told in books, only in bread-baking hands and silent glances across fields. You've stitched resilience into hymns brewed courage, into clay cups, hidden wisdom in the curve of a lullaby. And though you've been told, more times than you can count, that knowing too much is dangerous, you've learned that forgetting is worse, because someone must remember. Someone must hold the map through history's hush. And tonight, it's you. So let yourself rest now. Let the air hum gently. Let the past curl softly around you, like a wool blanket spun by women whose names the world never bothered to write down. You know them, even if the world doesn't. You carry their stories in your marrow, and they carry you back in dreams, in memory, in whispered breath. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.